Podcast mode, back in business, baby. What do you think, Samson? Do you like it? Okay. All right, you guys. We're going to skip the intro, but today we are going to talk about all the things that you're doing that you're probably not considering that are impacting your ability to focus and show up in adult in life. Yes, there are lots of things that I think that we need to talk about that need to be addressed when it comes to productivity and our ability to show up, be motivated, and feel ready to go in life. So I think I want to do this because what I've noticed is that a lot of times people will say, oh, it's just my ADHD. Oh, well, I'm just having a really bad ADHD day. And trust me, there are lots of times where I almost said shit, but you might as well say it, where that shit happens. And that's totally cool. And that's very true that there are some days that it's not giving what it needs to give. And that's okay. Brain, it's fine. However, especially over the last year and a half, 2 years that I've been diagnosed, I have learned so much when it comes to my ADHD and how I can impact it. And I like it especially because basically I was on Adderall for about 7 or 8 months, so not that long. And I was on a pretty low dose, but I've always been the type of person where I never wanted to be reliant upon a medication. I never wanted to be the person that needed those things to survive or live. And so that's why I think I was very so willing to come off the medication, on top of the fact that it just wasn't doing me a lot of good. It helped in the short term, but the way that I felt after I came off of it, it was not fun. I can go into a whole story about that, but that's not the point. The point is that over that time period, I learned that I have the ability to work with my ADHD and I have the ability to affect the way that I show up, that I had more power than I actually gave myself credit. What I want to do is I want to share these things with you so that you can feel empowered and not have all of those moments and just feel powerless with this ADHD. I want you to feel empowered and working with it. And even if you aren't diagnosed with ADHD, these are still things that I think are super helpful for you to understand, that if you're not having good focused or productive days, these are things that might be impacting your ability to show up and be focused, productive, all the good things, all the executive functioning things. So we're going to talk a little bit about those things today. And again, I just want to make sure that you understand that you can show up and you have the power to impact your focus and motivation more than you actually think. Sometimes it's just the ADHD, but sometimes there are other things. I want you to remember the body is super complex, it's very nuanced, and nothing works in isolation. So even though we have this thing going on up here, the ADHD, there are things that we put into it, the things that we do that are totally impacting our ability to focus. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about on the podcast today. All right. So we got 4 good things that we're going to talk about today. And the first one that I want to kick off with, and it's super near and dear to my heart because I just recently finished it up, is the blood sugar impact. So if you're not super familiar with the blood sugar, I'm not going to get too technical in this podcast because I don't want to overwhelm people. But essentially, when you eat, your blood sugar typically goes up. When you don't eat, it goes down. Hopefully not too much where you're hypoglycemic, but it typically goes down or doesn't have much impact. However, what people don't realize is that when you eat and it spikes down really quickly, which happens when we eat lots of carbs or a carb heavy meal, or it's not balanced. We'll talk about a lot of this later. But basically when that happens, it spikes really quickly and then it also drops very quickly because our body is trying to counteract that spike that we had. Our body's always trying to maintain that homeostasis. And so it has mechanisms, processes. Won't go into the science. It's painful for me not to go into the science because I love talking about that stuff. I'm a nerd, but we won't go into the science of it. I'm keeping things very distilled. So nobody show up in my comments well, that's not how it works. Listen, girl, I'm trying to help people. We're trying to keep the basics and the foundation. So keeping it high level. Okay. Anyways, that blood sugar spike and drop, when we're not keeping that blood sugar balanced, or for the most part balanced, it has a huge impact on your ability to focus, your anxiety maybe. When it drops, you typically feel very lethargic. You feel very tired. You feel anxious. You just don't want to do anything. And imagine if you do that all throughout the day. That is a roller coaster for your body. It's a roller coaster for your mind. It does not feel good. And I can tell you from personal experience, it was not fun. Essentially, I was feeling like a POS that day. Not a good day. Insert poop emoji over here. And I did not eat balanced meals whatsoever. So essentially what I did, I got up in the morning. I had a big bowl of cereal, everybody's favorite. I love cereal. Oh, so good. Added some sugar to it because who doesn't need a little bit of sweetness, and spike my blood sugar. But I was like, oh, well, I ate a balanced meal, had protein, carbs, fat. True. However, I'm just going to say it. Sweet breakfasts don't really do you a lot of justice, but we'll talk about different ways that we can mitigate that. To get ourselves back on track though, essentially I had that, I went up and then I came down, and when I came down, it was not fun. I felt super tired. I kind of felt a little anxious, like my heart rate's racing. And then, oh, by the way, my brain just wasn't there. I felt super demotivated. And oh, by the way, I was hungry again. So what do? I grabbed some candy because I was like, oh, I just need a little sneaky snack. Worst idea ever. So again, we repeat the cycle and the feelings, and then I was hungry again. So then I had just maybe like some rice or something because I was like, oh, my stomach doesn't feel super hot. Let me just get this. Rinse and repeat times 3. And you can see how that happened all throughout the day, multiple times a day. And that had a huge impact. That is a well-known thing that people don't talk about, is that when you're constantly spiking your blood sugar and your body's trying to counteract it, you have the brain fog, you have the anxiety, your ability to focus is just not there. So that's something that you need to consider, that if you're not eating those balanced meals or incorporating some of these blood sugar hacks that we can talk about on a different podcast, you more than likely are not going to want to focus. You're not going to have the motivation to do things. You're just not going to be able to show up as your best self an adult, aka something we struggle with as ADHDers. Okay, so a way to mitigate that is a couple different things. You can balance your blood sugar by eating balanced meals. So protein, carbs, fat, fiber is a big thing in there. Eating in a specific order. You can also incorporating apple cider vinegar. You can go on walks before, afterwards your meals. And when I say walks, it just has to be like 10 minutes, just nothing crazy, but just moving after your meal as well, instead of just getting up from the table and sitting down. Those are huge things that you can do that significantly help regulate or manage that blood sugar. We can do a whole nother podcast on that, but there are some resources. There's an awesome person. I cannot remember her name, but she is the Glucose Goddess on Instagram. And also she wrote the Glucose Revolution, which is an awesome book. And you can take a look at that, where she goes into all of the science if you're into it, but also more importantly, the different hacks. So that's something that you should definitely be considering, is your blood sugar. Basically, if you're eating super carb heavy meals without any protein or fat or fiber to help slow down that blood sugar spike, you are more than likely going to have that spike where you feel good for just a little bit, but then you eventually, that's the word I was looking for, you eventually feel that low and that crash. So something that you should take into consideration. So the second one that we want to talk about, hold on, make sure that I'm in focus. Is Beyonce in focus, y'all? Okay, I think we're good. So the second one that I want to talk about is related to exercise. And when I say exercise, I really mean movement. Basically, when we are moving or exercising, we are increasing those different neurotransmitters such as dopamine, norepinephrine, so on and so forth, serotonin, blah, 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 all the good stuff that makes us feel good. Just know that. Again, I'm not going to get too sciencey on this, but we are typically a very sedentary society. Bad news bears. We want to increase our movement or exercise to help us increase those neurotransmitters, which help us with the focus, the adulting, the executive functioning, all the good things, the productivity. When we are moving or exercising, we increase those things that help us actually show up in the way that we want to. If you're somebody who's more sedentary, chances are you probably are, and that's okay. We just want to start increasing slowly but surely from where you're at, a little bit of that movement, or incorporating a little bit of that movement into your day. So I am a big walker. I love walking. In fact, it is so great for me. Even throughout the day, I take multiple, maybe like 4 or so walks throughout the day, like in the morning, between breaks and stuff, after lunch, after meals, all that good stuff. I like to do it not only because it gives me a break. I cannot go for long periods of time typically if I'm not super interested or in a hyper focused session. So it gives me that like physical break to get outside, but also I get that movement that helps increase those neurotransmitters. Now, there is a book that specifically talks about how exercise increases like your dopamine, your ability to focus, all that stuff, and it's called Spark. I cannot remember authors to save my freaking life, and that's okay. But the book is called Spark, and they talk about all of the different research that suggests, or not suggests, but basically says that when you're exercising, your ability to focus increases because you have those neurotransmitters that increase shortly after you exercise. So if you're not already moving, I would highly suggest you do that because that has a huge impact on your productivity, your focus, and so on and so forth. That movement can look very different from person to person. If you don't like going to the gym or you're not feeling the gym, hot girl Pilates, hot girl walk, yoga. I can't think of anything else, but there's lots of other forms of movement. Even if you get outside and you play like team sports or something like that, that counts. Get your steps in, do your movement, whatever that may look like. I love walking. Catch me outside, even in the cold. I'm walking. I got my sneaks on and my scrunchy sock. Anyways, movement is a huge one. If you're not already doing that, making sure that you incorporate that so that you can show up and be a great adult. Okay, we're moving on to the next one. This is a newer one, and this one does not get enough press. And I have a theory. Part of it, I think, is because the wellness industry, it is my life goal to take you down, babe. You're not giving what you need to give. In fact, you've probably crushed a lot of lives. That's a little dramatic. But basically, I think the wellness industry really fucked up a couple of words, such as detox and toxins and stuff like that. Because I'm not going to lie, before my certification that I'm going through right now, the integrative health practitioner certification, toxins was not something that I really paid attention to. However, I always want to be very transparent with people and just give them the truth. And the ground truth is that we live in a very toxic world, which is okay. That's what we're working with. But understanding that we live in a very toxic world, we have to understand that the way in which our genes work, so ADHD is typically genetic, but the way in which our genes work is that not only do you have to have the predisposition, so the genes in your system, you also have to have these other things to turn them on, environment being one of them, such as toxins. So there's this awesome book by Stephen Cabral called The Rain Barrel Effect, and essentially it talks about that once your rain barrel gets filled up enough to the point that it starts overflowing and flooding, that's when things just start spewing, stuff is going everywhere, it's just a mess. That's very similar to what's going on in your body. So when we're younger, we have the ability to kind of work through these toxins, our liver's just kind of processing and doing its thing like it should. But as we add more and more toxic load to our body, and we're not doing the support to or giving the support to our liver that we need, that those genes start turning on. So that's one thing. If you have, or you're diagnosed with ADHD, those toxins might be turning on the genes. That's one. Two, if you just have a huge toxic load, there's so many other things that can be going on in your body that just don't make you feel good. And of course, we know that when you're not feeling good and you're not feeling super hot, you're less likely to show up like that star bright person in your life. And we don't want that. We want you to be able to show up. We want you to be able to focus and be productive. And a lot of times people don't consider their toxic load. So toxin exposure. One way to mitigate that is that you can take yourself through a functional medicine detox. Not going to go into that because that is, again, another huge podcast, but that is one way to do that. And when I say functional medicine detox, I want to be super clear that this is not like the freaking wellness industry. This is not like the detox where you just do a bunch of juices and blah, blah, blah. No, I think detox is sometimes not the right word for this. It's more of like a functional medicine liver support. It helps support your liver. So giving all those nutrients, vitamins, Ayurvedic, herbs and whatnot, so that it can go through and kind of just like push everything out, clean itself up and support itself so that it can really ramp up that detoxification process that your body naturally already does. So that's what I mean. I don't mean like this weird wellness detox stuff that I just think is complete BS on the internet, but we're not going to go there. I digress. So that is just another thing that I think you really need to be considering when you're like, oh crap, I'm really not being productive. It's the ADHD. Like, no, it could also be that we just have been not paying attention to our toxic load. So that's a little bit more of an abstract concept, but we can do a whole nother podcast on toxins and how that stuff works and how that impacts us and our ability to focus. But I want to move on. The last and final thing is our menstrual cycle. This is specifically for my menstruating peeps. If you're a person who is menstruating and off the pill, you should be very well aware of how your cycle impacts your ability to adult, your ability to be productive. As you may know, you have different phases of your cycle. So your bleed, that's when you're bleeding, duh. So your bleed, your ovulation, so that whole follicular phase stuff, and then you have your luteal phase. You should be very well aware that during certain times of your cycle, you have the ability to function really well. You're feeling super good. And then maybe at a different time, not so much. So essentially what's happening is that at the very beginning or the start of your cycle, I can show a little graph thing, pop it up here. I know that I'm going to do a lot of this in post edit, so it's funny because I'm like, pop it up here. So essentially at the very beginning of your cycle, when you're bleeding, your hormones are pretty low. So that progesterone, estrogen, I'm not going to talk about testosterone right now because that's not super important to this conversation. They're super low. Your estrogen peaks along with your testosterone as you're ovulating, and then it slowly drops off towards the end of your cycle, so the luteal phase, and then your progesterone during your luteal phase starts to climb up. So essentially, your estrogen has a huge impact on dopamine synthesis and its reuptake. Basically, it not only helps synthesize, so create your dopamine, create more, which we could definitely use some as ADHDers or people who lack it. And then on top of that, the reuptake, so it blocks or inhibits the reuptake so it doesn't use it up so quickly. So those are the two things that we struggle with as ADHDers, because we know that the issue with us is that we have the dopamine, we just use it up so quickly. We're very efficient users of our dopamine that we have, and we want to attempt to inhibit that. And that's essentially what a lot of these medication supplements do. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, but that's how a lot of them work. When you're on that latter part of your cycle, when your estrogen drops, you may notice that you're not as productive. You may notice that you probably don't want to do much, that you might have lower energy. Not only are those typical signs of your menstrual cycle, that's typically what happens, but also, that's just part of your estrogen lowering. What they also found in a different study is that not only does estrogen have an impact on this, but your progesterone levels too. If your progesterone levels are low, so typically if you're somebody who has like estrogen dominance, if your progesterone levels are low in comparison to your estrogen levels, that may also exacerbate some of the issues that you have when it comes to executive functioning. So if you're like the estrogen dominance person, you may not only have like the PMS symptoms, but you also might have a little bit of productivity issues. So just keep that in mind. That is just another thing that you should be considering if you're a menstruating person, is if I'm at a certain point in my cycle, I should be prepared and expect that I'm probably not going to be as productive, and that's okay. That's one thing that I really want to harp on in this podcast and any of the content that I create, is that I'm kind of over this, like I'm trying to override and force my body to do these things that it just doesn't want to do. Take for instance, when I wasn't being super productive, I'd like try to load myself up with like caffeine and like do all these things. And I'm like, no, I can do a whole nother podcast on like cycling and timing your menstrual cycle to like your life and stuff like that. So like syncing, I think it's called cycle syncing basically. But that is just something that we have to understand and accept that is okay, that at that point in our cycle, especially when you have very regular cycles, that is what's supposed to happen, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's just another thing that you should be considerate of when you're like, okay, well, I'm not feeling super productive. What's going on here? that's another one. So to recap, we have a couple of different things that you should consider that are impacting your productivity, your focus, your executive functioning, all that good stuff. And that's your blood sugar, your exercise/movement, and the toxic load that you might be exposed to, as well as your menstrual cycle if you're a menstruating person. Is this list exhaustive? No. Don't read me in the comments, because I know somebody's gonna be like, well, that's not the exhaustive list. I know, girl. I can't do it all. And also, like, that would be a really long podcast. The point is just to keep people thinking and understand that there are multiple different things that you might be doing or that might be going on in your body that are impacting your ability to focus that really don't have a lot to do with your ADHD. Like, ADHD is one thing, but then there's also what we're doing and how we impact it. Again, I want to show up and help you empower yourself so that you can be more productive, so that you can be focused. But I want you to also realize that empowering yourself means understanding that there are certain things that we have to do. What is my role? I know that I have ADHD. I know that there's things that I can and can't do, as well as neurotypicals, and that's okay. But there are things that I can control that can help mitigate some of those things and have me show up in a more productive or focused way. So I just want to leave you guys with that. I'm so excited. If you have any questions, you guys can find me on my Instagram. It's Brie Carter. You can also leave comments here. It might take me some time to, get through them. I want to be able to help people work with their ADHD. It's super important for me because, again, I don't want people to feel like they're trapped, like they're stuck, like, well, it is what it is. Like, I guess I'm just not going to be able to do these things and I just have to suffer. Like, absolutely not. We are not suffering 24/7. We are occasionally thriving. But I think it's super important for people to realize, like, you don't have to be stuck in this rut in life. You have the ability to absolutely thrive. There are things that you can do outside of just taking medication that can help you. And so that's exactly what my goal is trying to do in developing this content and putting it out there. So hopefully you found that super helpful. I'm going to shut up because I need to give my voice a break, feed my dog who is absolutely ready to eat. I hope you have a great day. I will talk to you guys very, very soon, and I'm super excited to see where things go.